We must demand what will shock the politicians. We must demand that they alter these programs in a way that imposes sacrifices on us. Social Security retirement must be moved back to age 70 immediately. Social Security benefits must be means-tested immediately. The wealthy get none. The upper middle class get none. The middle class take a small hit. The same thing with Medicare, means-tested immediately. As for Obamacare, if the Republicans get charge of even one House of Congress, they should simply refuse to fund a line of it. We don't have the money. We have no money. Precisely because the boomer generation is so large, we create the entitlement problem. And precisely because our generation is so large, we can solve the entitlement problem. If we will take a hit now, our children and grandchildren will never have to stare national bankruptcy in the face. All they'll have to do is what Congressman Ryan says: go over to some private retirement accounts and health care vouchers and higher premiums. Our sacrifice, together with that, will take this $60 to $80 trillion tornado and turn it into a cloud no bigger than a man's hand. But even with a reduction in entitlements, we come to the regular budget. What do we do about that? If we don't pay for the regular operations of government, which we haven't done in 80 years, then the debt just keeps piling up and the interest just keeps piling up, and eventually we go under. So what does President Obama suggest? He says we should take a portion of the federal budget and freeze it at 2009's bankrupting levels. Now, frankly, that's almost a joke. That won't even begin to balance the budget. So you turn to Congressman Ryan. And I'm afraid, again, he lets us down here because really his proposal, while it reaches more of the budget, is the same as President Obama's. Freeze the budget at the bankrupting levels of 2009. But 2009 spending is astronomical. It's stupefying. And it is absolutely unsustainable. If we follow President Obama's plan, the budget never gets balanced, the interest piles up, and we go under. If we follow Congressman Ryan's plan, because he does something about entitlements, the budget does get balanced in 2063. On Omaha Beach that day, the tide was coming in. If they'd stayed behind that seawall, they would all have drowned. And if we wait till 2063 to balance a budget, we will all have long since drowned under a rising tide of deficits, debts, defaults, and devalued dollars. So, what do we do about federal spending? Well, we need to think anew and act anew, as Lincoln says. We need to ask a different question about every dollar of federal spending. The question we've been asking up till now is this a good thing for the government to be doing? Is this important? Should we spend some money on that? And it's a legitimate question, but not when you're bankrupt. When you're bankrupt, the question is this more important than national solvency? And hardly anything is going to pass that test. Under that test, everything gets trimmed, cut, or slashed, or even stopped. So let's take a couple of examples. Let's start with a number of federal agencies that do things that normally belong to state and local government. Take the Department of Education as an example. How did the federal government ever get into education? Well, there's a good answer to that. The federal government has an advantage that state and local governments don't have, a big advantage, and that is the unlimited capacity to borrow and spend. But what we've just found out is it isn't unlimited. It's limited, and we've exceeded the limits. So now what do we do? Well, ask yourself this question: what would happen instead of having thousands of employees if the Department of Education had a handful of employees and a computer and a check printer? And what if the sole job of the Department of Education was to cut a check to each school district in this country for the same amount that that district got last year from the federal government? With thousands fewer employees, how much do we save on federal salaries, benefits, office rental, equipment? How much do we save? And there's a fair question: how much do we lose? And the answer is, we don't lose anything that any principal, teacher, or student will ever notice. What about agriculture subsidies? We've had them around for 80 years. They're there to save the family farm. And what's happened? For as long as we've had agriculture subsidies, the family farm has been disappearing. But at the same time, you and I and the working poor are paying taxes to give subsidies to millionaire sugar growers in Florida. There are billion-dollar agricultural companies that own farms in every state of this nation, and they're getting subsidies on every one of them. We have to means test agricultural subsidies immediately. Finally, just one last example, the Department of Commerce. The Department of Commerce is there to support business, to do research and to facilitate their doing business in foreign countries and so on. I wonder why, if I had a business that needed help with those things, I couldn't turn to another American business that provided that service and pay them to give it to me. As we stare national bankruptcy in the face, we have to ask that question. Is this more important than solvency? And that brings us to the biggest item in the budget, national defense. We are a great power with a global web of interests. But somewhere along the way, we seem to have lost the capacity to distinguish between an interest and a vital interest. Eisenhower's approach to national defense was to throw a nuclear umbrella over the 2 or 3 actual vital interests of this country and to handle everything else through alliances, diplomacy, intelligence, espionage, fomenting the occasional revolution, but not by sending divisions of American troops all over the globe. We need to go back and look at Eisenhower's model, and when we do, we can take comfort in this thought that Dwight Eisenhower knew more about national defense than anybody else who ever sat in the White House. We have met the enemy, and it is us, but even more, it is the people we have elected to office. The trouble with office holders in this country is that they believe you and I are spoiled children. They think we are too childish to face reality, too foolish to plan for the long run, and too selfish to sacrifice for our country. And that is why Congressman Ryan and President Obama both say we need to freeze federal spending. We don't need to cut it. They want you and I to believe that we don't actually have to give up anything we're getting now in order to balance the budget, and that's nonsense. Everybody has to give up something or the budget's never going to be balanced. And that's why Congressman Ryan says to us boomers, oh, you're going to get all your Social Security retirement, you're going to get all your Medicare, so that we will believe that somebody else has to climb this bluff, just not us. Well, we can't get off this beachhead and up that bluff without paying the price, just the way Sergeant Hamlet and his buddies paid the price. Do not forget those heads and arms and legs floating in the tide at Normandy. It is long past time that our so-called leaders stop lying to us about this simple fact. It's all got to be paid for, and it has to be paid for starting now. The real reason our chief executive and our members of Congress won't tell us the truth is they think we're selfish, and they think if they rub our noses in reality, we'll kick them out of office. And being in office is the one thing they live for. The TV interviews, the cocktail parties, the appearance of importance, that's what matters to them. And that's all that matters to them. The American people are not selfish, but we have certainly elected to government office a lot of people who are. Our politicians would rather be in office presiding over the decline and fall of this country than to be out of office because they told the truth and tried to prevent it. In his play King Richard II, Shakespeare put these words into the dying Duke of Lancaster's mouth. This land of such dear, dear souls, this dear land, dear for her reputation through the world, is now leased out. I die pronouncing it, like to a tenement or pelting farm. This land, bound in with the triumphant sea, is now bound in with shame, with inky blots and rotten parchment bonds. This land that was wont to conquer others hath made a shameful conquest of itself. Ah, would the scandal vanish with my life? How happy then were my ensuing death. We, the people, need not let America, which has been wont to conquer others, make a shameful conquest of itself. We do not have to lease out our country to the Chinese like a tenement or pelting farm. And we do not need to leave our children and grandchildren bound in the inky blots on rotten parchment bonds of debt. We can demand of the politicians something surprising. We can demand that the price start being paid, and not by the next generation, but by ours.